I would now like to welcome up the panel for our first conversation this morning. So if you're on that panel, please make your way on up to the stage. Our first conversation this morning will be discussing the impacts of regulatory uncertainty, which John teed up for us with his question, and how we keep California and in particular the Bay Area successful in this changing political climate. Our moderator this morning for this panel is Denis, a reporter for the Bay Area News Group, where he has covered issues near and dear to our hearts for more than 35 years. So please join me in welcoming moderator Denis and our esteemed panelists.
Let's get underway. Can you hear me okay? No? Better? Better? Okay, thank you. For our first speaker, we're going to hear from Robert Brown of the Western States Petroleum Association.
Thanks, Denis, and thank you to John Coleman and the staff at the Bay Planning Commission for putting this conversation together. I think it's an important one. I'm relatively new to the Western States Petroleum Association as the Bay Area director, and after 17 years with AAA, so I went from working on the mobile sources of 32 million plus cars that exist in California and growing, to now the stationary sources of our energy, and we represent 5 states, from Washington to Oregon, California, Nevada, and Arizona, and work on behalf of the petroleum-based energy companies, 26 of them throughout the territory, and get a little bit about WISPA that's been around 100 years. We're the trade association, and certainly know the challenges that the industry faces, particularly in California. And I was talking with Denis and some of the other panelists before coming on today, and it's certainly, people said, "Oh, you must be happy about the election results at the national level for your industry." And I said, actually, it probably makes it more difficult, because I think we're hearing more and more from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, the state of California, that they really want to double down and really have a aggressive approach toward the energy industry, in particular the petroleum-based energy. So that creates a lot of challenges, political and otherwise. But if we can go to the next slide, here in the Bay Area, there's 5 refineries, and we're talking about thousands of jobs, direct jobs at the refineries, somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 to 8,000. But when you're talking about indirect and induced employment, it's huge. And one thing I've learned very quickly is there are a lot of hardworking men and women in this industry that are science-based, that are fact-based, and we've been working with a lot of them on how they get their story across before the regional agencies and before the state agencies. So the Air Resources Board focuses on the mobile sources of pollution, and the Air District here locally focuses on the stationary sources. And so we're talking over 80,000 jobs, 4.2 billion to the local tax revenue, and then generating more than 77 billion in economic impact. And when we're talking about the pollutants that create smog, the stationary sources, the refineries, are only about 2 to 3% of that. And when you look at the other forms of pollution in the wintertime, the biggest source is wood-burning fires. So a lot of it is really wanting to get those facts out and have a fact-based discussion when we're coming before the regulators. And if you can jump to the next slide. This is just an example of the number of agencies at the federal, state, and regional level and local level that oversee our industry, or that we have some dealings with. I think this was a sample from Chevron. but it's, fairly consistent with the other 4 refineries: Valero, Phillips 66, Tesoro, and Shell. And, so the 4 based in Contra Costa County, 1 is in Solano County. So it's a very focused approach, and we want to make sure that the science of the industry, the facts of the industry, getting mutual goals and shared goals when we're talking with regulators at the Air District or at the Air Resources Board, that they understand that, hey, we have made huge progress in this industry, and in terms of reducing smog, toxic air contaminants, and I think that there's enough credit to go around from the regulators to the regulated, and we just want an open, fact-based discussion. And when politics enters into it, when you have activist groups that are forming around one particular rule or agenda, we want to make sure that our story gets out there, and it's increasingly hard to do in this environment. 24-hour news cycle, the multiple layers that we have to go before, but we're intent about getting that story out there, so we can get more into it into the conversation about some of the specific rules, and I can illustrate more by example. But again, thanks for the opportunity.
And our next speaker will be Leslie Moulton-Post of Environmental Science Associates.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we are live. Thank you very much. And Bob, I appreciate your comments and your last slide. That was a fairly daunting list of regulatory agencies that participate in his industry. But I'd like to lay out a premise with a few exceptions that there isn't that much uncertainty in the regulatory arena in California as a result of the new administration. And let me clip through sort of the main areas of regulation. The Clean Water Act, we've had an executive order to review the definition of waters of the U.S., but that review is only just beginning, if it has. It will take a fair amount of time to decide what to do as a result of that review, and we know that any changes at the federal level will certainly take many years, and California is not changing its regulatory scheme for regulation of wetlands. So I would say easily for the next 4 years of this administration and longer, there will not be regulatory uncertainty under the Clean Water Act. I would say similarly under the Endangered Species Act, really the same argument. There is certainly a conversation about looking at and possibly revising the Federal Endangered Species Act. That's going to take a good amount of time, and it's only just now being set in motion. And California is not changing its regulations with respect to permitting and regulating endangered species. So I don't think we have uncertainty there. I appreciate that we may want to see some changes in both regulation and the process, but we all don't like uncertainty, and I'm suggesting we don't have uncertainty in these areas. In the area of the Clean Air Act, we do have some uncertainty, some questions about whether the feds will change the waiver that California has for our vehicle emission standards, and therefore whether California will have a different set of standards than the feds. This becomes very complicated for industry, and I appreciate that that is something that, one, is uncertain, and two, would be difficult if we were really trying to manage against 2 sets of standards. But that remains to be seen. That action hasn't been taken either. I think, unfortunately, where we do have some uncertainty that affects us all is in the area of funding. Both funding for some of our regulatory programs, absolutely our regulatory staff that are not helping us make the process of permitting more efficient or speed it up. Contrary, slowing it down is probably what we're going to see as a result of staffing freezes and staffing reductions at our regulatory agencies. We have less money likely coming to us for research in climate change, water quality, and some of the other key areas that are important to us to move forward. So that's an unfortunate area of funding uncertainty. And we have the promise of funding in infrastructure, which would be extremely beneficial to the Bay Area and California, but that's rather uncertain at this point because we don't have any concrete information about how that funding might arrive or land on our infrastructure projects. So that's a real opportunity, but not certain at this point. And for California attempting to meet its own standards for greenhouse emission reductions, changes in Clean Air Act regulations, et cetera, could impede our ability to meet those standards that we set for ourselves. So that's another area of uncertainty. But I would say we could take off the table some concern about regulatory uncertainties in some of our major areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Our next speaker is Eric Sapirstein, President of ENS Resources.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, John, and the coalition or council for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to tell you what's going on in Washington. It's a little mix of what Leslie said and a little bit of what you probably have read in the newspapers. But what's going on? Well, you know the declarative judgments, right? It's going to be huge, it's going to be great, and most importantly, it's going to be drain the swamp. And, you know, when we drain the swamp, the joke in D.C. is, do you need a 404 permit to do that? And as a lobbyist, the question is, am I an endangered species? I think after yesterday's sort of breaking news that was basically continuing into this morning, I don't know if the president's greatness is what he was thinking it was going to be, but we'll see. Look, looking forward, we have to ask ourselves, what does this all mean? If the president has his conceptual understanding realized in Congress and in the administration as a whole, we are looking at the largest change in federal relations with the state governments and local governments since the Great Society. That's what's at stake here. Whether you're pro or con, that's what this is all about. And at root, as Steve Bannon said, this is about taking down the deep state. Translate it, the infrastructure that's been built over the last 60 years in Washington and in the state level and local level. So today, in the few minutes I have, let me explain to you what I think is going to happen with respect to a couple of key issues: reinventing government, reg reform, the budget process, and infrastructure. First of all, on reinventing government, one of the biggest challenges we have right now is the lack of folks that are in decision-making positions in the federal bureaucracy. You have an administrator, by example, at EPA, and nobody below him to manage the day-to-day programs. His chief of staff is running the agency, where the administrator has to recuse himself from doing any kind of decision-making because of his role as Attorney General of Oklahoma. Similarly, for you folks, the Corps of Engineers, we still don't have a leadership in place at the Corps of Engineers. After over 100 days, you have to ask yourself, this is not more than politics, is it? Maybe it's by design to hobble the bureaucracy. Second, on reg reform, we're coming to a close of the Congressional Review Act. That's the law that allowed the Congress to overturn a lot of the Obama administration rules. That's important because whether or not you wanted to see rules overturned or maintained, we're going to get into what I like to call regulatory hand-to-hand combat going forward, because there's no mechanism to roll back rules or put new rules in place going forward. The other thing to keep in mind with regulatory reform are the executive orders. We've had over 32 executive orders to deal with regulations, getting government out of our business activities and expediting projects and what have you. Here's the ugly little secret. The executive orders have a whole bunch of off-ramps. So you can't overturn rules that are statutorily required or have been court ordered the way they're written. So does that impact the environmental rulemaking process? Yeah, but in the end, minimally, I think. The real issue is going to be, will there be new rules issued? And I think the answer is, with the president's executive order, that you have to get rid of 2 rules for every new rule that you want to implement, and the fact that the agencies have to submit a rulemaking agenda to the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, for approval, and to ensure that there are no net costs to the government or to the private sector or the public sector. That's going to be very hard to see any real effective rulemaking going forward, which raises the issue of more chaos and dismantling of the deep state. On the budget, I'm going to disagree with Leslie on one key point. She's absolutely correct about what the budget process may or may not hold for us. It's uncertain. But I will tell you that the recent decision on funding the government for this current fiscal year was important. It was not a continuing resolution. It was an omnibus bill. It set a baseline for fiscal year 18. And if you think we're going to have a whole bunch of individual spending bills come September 30th, the president has already said he'd like to have a governmental shutdown. I think that foreshadows a continuing resolution, which for us, if it's a true continuing resolution, means that current year spending prevails and there's lots of money for resiliency, for infrastructure, and everything else in between. Well, let me paraphrase that a little differently. There's enough money, not a lot of money. And finally, infrastructure. So we're going to privatize our nation's infrastructure, and we're going to get offshore dollars into this country to fund infrastructure. I would not put money down on that. After yesterday's firing of Comey, it has upended anything in Congress getting done on a big level. And tax reform is that big level. And if you don't have tax reform to bring dollars in, you have the conservative Republicans say we're not going to spend more money to do infrastructure. It increases the deficit. The Democrats say we have to increase the deficit and spend money for infrastructure development. You have a real problem in figuring out how to go forward. So at the end of the day, I think you see continued support for core infrastructure programs at sort of maintained levels of spending, which in this environment right now, leading up to the 2018 congressional elections, is a good thing for all concerned. So where are we? It's really a ball of confusion. I had a great presentation before yesterday's firing. It all went out the window. I think you're going to see a lot of political infighting over this and this Russian investigation. If you thought it was just politics at the beginning, this is going to dictate the progress on all these issues, whether it's reg reform, reinventing government, or infrastructure funding in the next 6 to 8 months. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Our next speaker will be Alexis Straus, who is the acting regional administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here with you. I've enjoyed in prior Bay Planning Coalition meetings talking about water infrastructure and working with many of you. And today I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. I'd like to talk about drinking water. I may be a very happy East Bay Mud customer, but I, as the acting regional administrator, am faced with many thousands of small drinking water systems that are not serving safe drinking water to their customers in California alone. It's replicated across our western region, the western states, Hawaii, and the 3 Pacific Island territories. So I thought I'd just give you a few slides to illustrate the problem. Not that this is the right venue for us to solve this problem, but in our shared awareness as Californians, I think that we can come together and make a big difference, and it would benefit all of us. EPA, in our amazing ability to create terms of art in regulation, talks about drinking water systems as community water systems. And you can see here that here in California we have a large number of systems, but 78% of them are small. The large systems we know run well. They have a great technical, managerial, and financial depth to them. But the small systems really struggle, and they are the ones that serve 3,300 or fewer people. We have many small communities in California. Next slide. This slide is about water systems that have violations. And although the right-hand side of the slide will tell you that the large systems don't have very many violations, most of the violations we see are in the small systems, 91%. And that affects about 700,000 people, more or less. It comes and goes depending on monitoring data. Next slide. If we look at the most common kinds of violations in drinking water systems, because of our geology in California, arsenic, which is naturally occurring, is dominant at about 45%, that big red chunk that you see there. And some of the others, like nitrates, 15% in the green, the microbials, about 13% in the yellow. The disinfection byproducts rule, or DBPR, we always have these crazy terms, about 12%. Radionuclides, about 12%, and then a host of others. Look how small the lead and copper violations are when you think about the situation that we've gone through in the last year with Flint. It really even doesn't measure up. So California's not a big place for lead and copper violations. Next slide. Forgive me, but across the bottom axis are all the counties in California with current health-based violations. If we were to focus on where our predominant problems are, they're in the San Joaquin Valley, and you can see that the counties to the left, Kern, Fresno, Madera, and then Tulare, with Monterey sticking out there, are where I should be focusing our attention with our state and local partners. So this again is the small community water systems. Next slide. And so what we've done in EPA Region 9 in San Francisco is work with our state partners and put together a plan that focuses on small systems. If I were to look at all the small systems, I think we would get lost for a couple of years. And so we picked out 4 areas where we, EPA, were going to look at system-specific problems and try and bring them into compliance. And we picked arsenic, lead, schools, and tribes. Schools are in a unique situation where sometimes parents and families may not have data about the quality of water served in schools because they are not always a community water system, or they may be served by a community water system. And so we're doing a great deal more outreach. There's some interesting long-standing culture in the drinking water program that says that EPA is sort of at arm's length from the state, and the state is a little bit at arm's length from the system itself, and there may be a county or a CUPA in between in California. And there have been times when I thought it was really important that we just pick up the phone and have a conversation directly with the system and say, yes, we know there are many partners involved in regulating drinking water, but what is your data telling you about the water you're serving in this school? Because we don't have any data for you in our data system. That kind of direct, enhanced engagement with systems is part of getting more real-time information where some of the electronic data systems may not be serving our purposes. We have money to put out there. All of our panelists have talked about infrastructure money, and EPA capitalizes a drinking water and a wastewater revolving loan fund in each of our states every year, and the state leverages that money very well. It's a lot easier to lend money to a large system, as you can imagine, than to a small system. And sometimes small systems know they have an issue, but they don't have the technical wherewithal to know what money they should use to fix it. We're also re-examining, I think, long-held cultural biases against some of the solutions. Sometimes an in-home device is a better solution than a pipe that's not going to be laid for the next 10 years for reasons of cost. There's long been a bias against some of those point-of-use devices because, like the oil filter in our cars, they need to be maintained and replaced. And over the years, I think people have grown away from relying on things that need to be done in the home and need to be done on a certain cycle. But I think we are returning to look at that anew because that is part of the solution. So next slide, I think that's probably my last slide. Our goal is to reduce exposure in these small systems to arsenic and lead, particularly for schools and tribes. And in just a fairly short period of time, we've seen 53 systems return to compliance. It just shows what a little bit of greater focus for us will do. And we have 94 systems, which is about 2/3 of our universe, with the state under compliance orders. Each of our western states is, for the first time, testing all schools for lead. And it will be very interesting for us to look, after this cycle finishes this year, at how California, Nevada, and Arizona did this differently, but what they may have found, and make sure that in schools, students can have access to safe drinking water as opposed to any of the alternatives. I think that is my last slide, but I just wanted to tee that up. It's not typical that we would at Bay Planning Coalition have a conversation around drinking water, but I think we're at the cusp of some really different approaches in California that are very exciting, and I wanted you to be aware of the problem and the fact that there's a lot of energy and even some proposed legislation around it. And I would love to talk about anything else that all the panelists have talked about. Thank you, Denis.
Okay, for the next part of the program, first off, we have an instant poll question. which the Bay Planning Coalition staff are going to post, I believe, on the board. So take a look, and there's directions for texting in your direction. It is on topic. Also, in the next part of the program, we're going to move to a informal discussion between the panel members about some questions, and then we'll have questions from the audience at the end. But panel members, please feel free to throw in. This is not just to one person. I thought I would start with pose a question related to greenhouse gas regulation. California and the Bay Area is a hotspot for this. As you may know, we've got the Trump administration in Washington saying, roll them back. We've got the governor and the legislature saying, we're going to do our own thing. We don't care what's going on in Washington. And then even in the Bay Area, we have the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which even later this month is talking about adopting a cap on oil refineries, which would include a cap on greenhouse gases and some other pollutants. It is very controversial. So I wanted to throw out a question to the audience. What do you foresee in regulation of greenhouse gases in the coming years? And how will this affect consumers and businesses? Bob, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, so one of the things I referred to earlier, actually Leslie talked about predictability, and that is very important for our industry and many industries, is you want to have some predictability for your business 3 to 5 years out for your industry, to be able to manage your employees, to be able to run an effective business, and in our case, a clean, environmentally sound, and safety business. Safety is so paramount to the employees. With greenhouse gases, it's a global pollutant, obviously, and the Air Resources Board at the state level has jurisdiction over that. Denis referred to a greenhouse gas cap. This was a rule actually written by one of the activist groups. The Bay Area Air District's own staff has been critical of it in their staff analysis. They've said it's legally not defensible. I'm paraphrasing here. It would run counter to the state's cap and trade program. The advisory council to the board basically said, we don't advise moving forward this rule, look to an alternative. And over a year ago, the state's own air board said this would run counter, don't have a local cap on greenhouse gases. Over time, in the past year, the Air District has come up with not one, but 2 alternatives. So all 3 rules are still in play. The board has yet to vote, the Air District has yet to vote on this GHG cap written by the activist groups. And so we've basically testified at hearings about the shortcomings of this rule and looking at some of the alternatives, trying to have a very, as I mentioned earlier, a fact-based discussion, a rational discussion about this, and it's been very challenging. So that predictability, and then recently the Air Board came in with a letter that kind of was sent to the local Air District that said, well, keep going with all 3 rules, we'll work something out. It was a little bit of a vagary there. So again, that predictability is turned on its head, and we don't want a system where rules conflict with each other. Nobody does. We want to know kind of who's on first, and to be able to comply with a rule effectively. And this has been very challenging, and it's a perfect example of kind of knowing who's in charge and being able to work out what is the shared goal. I mean, several years ago, we had a great process between I think the industry, with the environmental groups, with the Air District, working staff to staff in formulating rules, understanding a common picture of what the goals are. Now these rules are coming fast and furious. They're written hastily. It's influenced by politics. And what we're getting is rules that are incomplete or counterproductive. And we need to get back to a system where it's more of a conversation, so you're developing effective rulemaking. And I would say that the process right now is broken, and we'd like to get it back to a process where there's a constructive conversation, because everyone wants clean air, everyone wants healthy air, and everyone wants the safety.
Bob, you touched on one of the questions I had for you, which is just, did the process change? And so you're making it sound like it did. You know, our best process is where all the stakeholders are involved and helping inform the discussion. So I have understood that these recent rules are not coming with industry input, and I sort of wonder, you know, why the process changed. And I also would like to ask, you know, how the industry is getting on top of the conversation about, you know, the life cycle emissions, because this is some of our issue where we try to clamp down at one part in the process, but of course we're all trying to understand the larger perspective. And I'm referring in particular here to the draft rule regulation 13 Rule 1, which is about the carbon intensity of a barrel of oil, and that is one piece of the process. But if you're working overall to bring down emissions with better fuel economy, et cetera, that might not be your best place to focus. And I wonder if the industry can bring that information about life cycle carbon emissions to the discussion.
No, I think it's critical, and that rule was only recently released. We've only recently submitted extensive, 15 pages of comments on that one from a technical standpoint. It's funny, I come from a big family, and it's organic chemist, a couple mechanical engineers, and 2 business majors. So I'm a liberal arts major from UC Davis. So someone's got to work that side of the brain in the family. But I think it underscores the complexity of this business and what goes into it. And that life cycle that you reference, it's a suite of regulations that we're working with right now, and it's all of them have a piece to the puzzle, but it is a challenging environment to say the least.
Eric, Alexis, would you like to weigh in any on what, maybe from the federal level, on what you see happening with greenhouse gas regulation in D.C.?
So we live in alternate universes as opposed to alternate facts. I think at the federal level, you've read the papers, you've seen the stories, what have you, what this administration is doing with respect to climate change. I think the difference at the federal level is that the focus is more and more, at least in Congress, on resiliency, that there is a priority within Congress to address the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. You see it in testimony from states, communities, folks like Bob, who are asking for certainty but also assistance in addressing the impacts of climate change. It's almost like if you were a Valley girl, you'd say that's so yesterday about greenhouse gas emissions, because folks are asking, how are we going to address the impacts from climate change? It's almost like we can't waste time on whether or not we have climate change or not. We have fundamental concerns, and you saw that back with Katrina. You've seen it recently in California with the incredible rain events and snow events. And on the East Coast, it was 90 degrees in April when we had the climate march in Washington. These things are bringing home the fact that there have to be solutions to address the impacts to the delivery of public services, as well as just the economy maintaining progress. So from a federal perspective, I don't see a lot going on in the next couple of years with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, cap and trade, climate change, what have you. But the saving grace is I do see a lot of focus going on infrastructure responses to resiliency.
I think, and in that regard, there's a continued interest in bringing at the state and local level here in California low emission and zero emission infrastructure into key parts of our cities and into the San Joaquin Valley. While the national and state conversation around greenhouse gas will continue and perhaps not be resolved, in California we have 2 of the foremost pollutants from an air perspective in both ozone and particulate matter. The PM 2.5 standard is known for South Coast and for San Joaquin affect a very large proportion of us, and at a national level, if we were looking at a pie chart, it's remarkable. So we have a great deal of work ahead of us, regardless of the greenhouse gas outcome, to deal with how can we address mobile sources, how can we reduce emissions as the opportunities present themselves, how can we help drive technological innovation, and I'm very optimistic that the investments we are making and the funding that is out there to help do this, California will continue to be that innovator.
But we've heard a lot about how things are unclear in Washington, D.C. with the administration. But I'd like to ask the speakers, what are the ways that the most important ways that the administration has changed environmental regulations?
Well, let's see. We had the dismissal of the Science Advisory Board, or actually a subgroup of the Science Advisory Board, a couple of days ago, so that from an EPA perspective, science right now is sort of in the back of the thought process as they look at what the policies are going to be. The administrator has said, this will cheer you, Bob, the administrator has said that he wants to put industry in that can advise him on the science, so he gets all stakeholders in the decision-making process. You know, that's not a bad thing, but the way it's going on as far as how we make decisions in Washington right now, you know, it's sort of a hatchet approach. It's not a scalpel approach. So I think from a decision-making process, you're going to see a lot of turmoil and a lot of litigation surrounding any decisions that are made. So I think that's the biggest impact that you will see with respect to what's going on in Washington right now.
Any other comment? Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, again, back to my original premise, I don't think really much has changed yet on the ground, and it hasn't changed in California, and our own legislature passed additional anti-backsliding legislation to preserve in place regulatory standards that reflect either California's high standards or the Fed standards should they change. So at this moment in time, we're sort of set with our local landscape of regulation, but I do think, you know, to your point, that there is kind of concern and uncertainty around the EPA. I commend to you a op-ed piece that was in the New York Times by Williams Reckleshouse, who was the original first EPA administrator, and you may remember came back to the EPA in 1983 at the request of Ronald Reagan to really try to repair the morale and the reputation of the EPA after a pretty thorough bashing in the early 80s about how it was really an obstruction to growth and economic development. And the public lost confidence in the EPA, and industry came to Mr. Ruckelshaus and said, would you please restore the reputation of the EPA as an independent and credible regulatory organization, because it is essential for the smooth functioning of our economy. So I hope we don't continue to sort of undermine our ability to fairly regulate, absolutely streamline and improve regulation where we can, but this sort of wholesale bashing of the EPA, in particular science and regulation, I think will just destabilize us and not get us to where we want to be with a more efficient process.
We've mentioned some of the executive orders, one of which is to take comment on areas where the public, where industry and others feel that a regulation should be rescinded or revised or shaped. That's a great exercise to do, and each of the major EPA offices, the Air Office, the Water Office, the Pesticide Office, has been having these sessions where people call in or submit comments. And I think 50, 60, 70,000 comments have been received, and you have to then wonder from a procedural point of view, what do you do with 50, 60, 70,000 comments that aren't exactly aligned around a few changes? I think practically speaking, there are no doubt some really good ideas in that, but I don't know how that executive order will play out. The business of rescinding a regulation takes time. EPA is not quick to promulgate new regulations at the best of times. Look how long the water rule took. And so I don't know that in this term, this 4-year term, that much of the pent-up interest in regulatory change will result in a greater efficiency, but I think there'll be lots of ideas out there. And therein lies just a great deal of confusion, as the panel has mentioned. It's really important that the administrator get his Senate-confirmed individuals to run the air office, the water office, and the like. It's very difficult to run our agency of 15,000 with a very tiny team that is the new political administration. So here in the Southwest, as in all 10 of the EPA regional offices, I would say 95% of the work that we have been doing and do, we should continue to do with great focus on public service. And if there are regs that are going to be changed, it's going to take some time from an administrative process to revoke something, to put something new out there for comment, to find 2 regs to rescind in order to add 1, to make sure that the net cost is 0. So I don't think that's going to play out in a productive way soon. It is confusing.
Yeah, I'll just add to underscore the importance of, kind of to your point, de-escalating some of the conversation and the vitriol and whatnot. I think it's important not to have that common understanding. I mean, we're looking at an industry I mentioned earlier that's had the past 30 years, refineries have reduced emissions at more than twice the rate of other sources, a greater than 60% reduction in criteria pollutants since 1990, and average Bay Area risk from exposure to toxic air contaminants has been reduced by 83%. You know, and it's not, it's the work of the agencies, it's the work of the regulated community working together and having that conversation. And I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I think it is very important that we kind of de-escalate the charges and the counter charges and understand the facts going forward, that there's a lot to be proud of. It doesn't mean we stop there and we don't keep working to make it better. But we can't, it's hard to do in the current environment. And hoping that the political pendulum can kind of swing more toward the middle, if you will, so that we can have that balanced conversation.
So, Denis, I'm picking up on that, Bob. You know, the silver lining in this one is, as much as you can say we don't like the uncertainty that Washington is creating right now, the political havoc and everything else, what this disruption, which is the Trump administration, by their own declaration, does bring about is a real clear understanding that the regulatory process has become the end. It's no longer developing a permit so that the permit is the end. It's the process. It never ends. You know, you seek an application, you put it in, you can try and get your permit, whether it's a 404 or an NPDES in general, and it takes forever. And I think the good news is that Democrat, Republican, or anybody in between on the spectrum, they all understand that it's no longer acceptable to have just a process as the end result, that you need to figure out a way to do things better. I like to make the analogy that if you're given the chance to drive a Model T or a Tesla, I think most of us would say we'll go with the Tesla. And that's the challenge. We're working with rules and processes that were developed in the 70s for the most part, and we need to figure out a way to do things smarter and better. And that doesn't necessarily leave you at a point where it's bad for the environment or the economy. There's just smarter ways to do things.
One question that was submitted by a member of the Bay Planning Coalition. What are the greatest risks facing California and the Bay Area due to the current federal administration?
It's still early.
Anyone?
I mean, I think our government was set up with a lot of checks and balances. You know, I'm not one to comment on the current federal administration. I do think it's early. I do think, you know, you do see a natural pendulum shift. I think the media still plays a very influential role in that. I think the 24-hour news cycle of social media and the constant attention and pushback, I think the way community groups and advocacy groups, whether it's representing industry or the environment or healthcare, I think they can coalesce in a hurry. They can have a very vocal impact, the way they can mobilize. So I'm hopeful that I think with some of that pushback on both ends, quite frankly, both ends of the political spectrum can I think push us more toward a reasonable middle and discussion. Call me idealistic or optimistic, but.
Well, I think in the near term, I think, Denis, you made reference to this, I think, about the clean air waiver. I think that's probably the biggest impact. If the administration decides to deny California the continued use of its waiver under the Clean Air Act for stricter air standards in this country at large and for automobiles in specific, that sets the tone that California is going to be in court for a very long time on any number of issues challenging the federal bureaucracy as we know it. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge, going back to the earlier comments of uncertainty versus certainty. That's probably it.
Anyone else want to weigh in? It's.
The poll. I was interested in the question.
How is the poll going? Is that working?
I saw the results at one point on the poll that you took. Where'd those go? Because, I mean, 45% said that they had already experienced some uncertainty in their regulatory process or expected it in the next year. So it would be great to hear some audience examples of what you've already encountered as a result.
We'll get that on the audience. Good point. Thank you. A question. Who is most likely to benefit under the current administration, and who is most at risk?
Well, I think, one thing that we've been talking about is two things. A lot of executive orders and a lot of let's review, let's consider rolling back, but without staffing our agencies, et cetera. And unfortunately, events that are sort of overshadowing all this with the FBI and the Russian investigation. I mean, they're really diverting attention from, I think, what many of us hoped might be some pretty nuts and bolts movement on infrastructure and regulation, et cetera. So I think, that is a risk that we're just completely distracted from the work we need to get on with.
Yeah, I would agree. And if you turn the conversation to tax reform, if they can't figure out a way because of the healthcare debate, and the healthcare debate is all about, aside from rolling back Obamacare, it's about taxes, okay? And finding the revenue to do tax reform. If they can't figure out a way in the administration and in Congress to find the revenues to do tax cuts because they can't roll back completely the healthcare law, then they've got to look for other money. So I think the obvious shall we say, candidate would be tax-exempt bonds and the ability to fund infrastructure. Because back in the 80s, the Supreme Court ruled that tax-exempt financing is not a God-given right to local and state interests. But it continues because it's got over 100 years of support and use. But there's a lot of revenue lost, trillions of dollars lost to the federal treasury from that tax-exempt status. So at the end of the day, if they're serious about doing tax reform or tax cuts, and you saw that in the president's one-pager on what his tax bill would look like, the possibility of the elimination of tax-exempt bonds, the possibility of the elimination of the deductibility of state and local taxes from your federal taxes, that's where a real threat would occur.
Yeah, I think having some predictability to really get to the nuts and bolts of the problems this country, the state, the region faces, it's constantly being distracted. And I think when you speak of taxes, I would say even at the state level, I wish that our own state budget would, it's been through a number of governors have tried it, Democrat and Republican, to get a more reliable source of funding so that we're not in this boom and bust cycle and we can have some predictability from year to year. And I think the federal deficit, you're seeing a simplistic tax system that's predictable, that's, you can count on the revenue. And I just think those basic things that government actually could step in and help, and how they run the treasury could be very critical. But when you've got these outlying distractions that are more political or legal in nature, that it takes away from that, or takes away from the best use of our funding toward investing in our infrastructure going forward.
What will the California legislature's role be during the Trump era as regulations change?
Oh, I think we're seeing it. I mean, I think they're using their own particular bully pulpits to, rail against the federal government, rail against President Trump, and I think they've got some traction there, particularly in states like California. But again, I think it's masking some of the problems that we need to face that maybe aren't as media worthy, or as soon as you get into the weeds of some of these very complex problems, I think you can kind of lose the attention of people. And I think if you stay on the very high level and are able to register some immediate reaction and immediate kind of poll results, I think that's what moves the needle. But I think it's creating more noise than is helpful for what we need to achieve.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Sure. We're a big and diverse state, and I think it's really important that we and many of the things that we enjoy here in this metropolitan area, we need to keep in mind some of the more rural counties and what their infrastructure needs are. I'm not convinced that we successfully keep them on our radar screen. We don't seem to have that many conversations as a state. There seems to be quite a bit of division, as we saw even just from the election results. And so for the infrastructure money that we at EPA do have, and the ability we have to influence investments in air quality, in water infrastructure with our state partners and the like, I think we have to make a very conscious effort to reach the smaller communities and to make an important on-the-ground difference.
Now, Alexis mentioned infrastructure, which is being debated very much these days. As you know, California is moving to raise gas taxes significantly to try and fix its roads. What other ways do you think California and the nation should be looking at funding infrastructure improvements?
One of the ways that I touched on earlier is how small communities are able to pay for the basic services that we, with a larger rate base here, are able to sustain. And I think we need a more concerted set of statewide solutions to help small communities. We cannot continue with thousands and thousands of small drinking water and wastewater systems. They can't afford their most basic fixes. It's easy to want to consolidate or to compel them to consolidate. There is the ability at the state level to do that, but there is also this illusion of losing local control. And I do think when you think about what are the main ingredients of a healthy local community or a rural county, we need to help solve this.
Yeah, we're certainly, Dennis, you referenced the gas tax. It's 12 cents that people are going to start seeing at the pump. I think it's going to make California number 2 behind Pennsylvania come November as far as gas taxes go. It's something like 84 cents a gallon. You're going to see the vehicle license fees, registration fees go up depending on the age and type of your car come January 1. We're relying on kind of our traditional system of funding that we have for many years. We're relying on the infrastructure, whether it's UC, whether it's our roads, probably our water systems, everything that were established from generations before us, and it's time to upgrade, make those repairs. But it's a system of funding and revenue that we've traditionally relied upon. I think you're hearing things about a vehicle miles tax or different ways to have congestion pricing or hot lanes and that sort of thing to fund our roads and infrastructure, and some of that goes toward transit. Transit's extremely expensive. I think we all agree that we would like better connectivity with it. BART is very expensive. There's a number of labor problems that it has to navigate through as well. So there's definitely challenges, and we're probably paying the price now when it comes to transportation for putting that off too long. And now there's going to be a big shockwave in consumers' pocketbooks the fourth quarter of this year But you know, the roads, the bridges, the highways, the transit systems are in desperate need, and I don't think anyone would deny that. But again, like I talked about the budget, I think we need a sustainable, predictable form of revenue going forward. So we are going to have to start thinking outside the box, because cars are getting better mileage, so that gas tax revenue is declining in how much we gain from that. We have 32 million cars in this state. We're using 40 million gallons of fuel every day in this state to drive those cars. At 95% run on traditional fuels. There's 10 million gallons of jet fuel a day that we're using in California for our airways. So it's a big mountain to climb. And then we're trying to get to a point where there's a little bit more balance in the alternative fuels and alternatives. So one thing this transportation bill did also was put a annual fee on electric cars, but that doesn't go into effect until 2020. Probably looking to incentivize more people to invest in them. But my only point in bringing that up is that the scale of which we have to get to, it's going to take some time.
So from a federal perspective, this is the defining issue, I think, for how federalism goes forward. You hear about public-private partnerships, you hear about privatization. You know, from a water perspective or a port perspective, I don't see how you put a public-private partnership together on the really huge projects out there. It's a road you can put a toll booth on, right? I don't see putting toll booths on ports when the ship comes in. I mean, you get your fees through the ship coming in, but I think from an infrastructure perspective, you've got this dynamic tension going on in Washington right now. Do you continue supporting the core programs that have built this infrastructure that makes the country work, and which Bob points out needs to be rebuilt? And do you experiment? And perhaps the experimentation is new ways of finding funding through innovation, like WIFIA program or loan guarantees, what have you. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, the chairman of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in the House, Bill Schuster, when pressed about privatization and creating infrastructure banks and what have you, his response was quite to the point. And this was in an open meeting. He said, we already have an infrastructure bank. It's called the bond market. So at the end of the day, what happens on infrastructure and the solutions to fund infrastructure will carry with it, I think, how the federal government interacts with the local and state interests. And that's probably the biggest question that has to be solved, because right now, Alexis makes the point about rural communities. You have some of the most conservative members of the Senate saying, hey, you know, I come from a small state. Public-private partnership isn't going to work for a small community. We need to have direct federal support to build water projects, to build roads and what have you. So there is this real debate going on right now of how we go forward.
You want to weigh in? Okay. Maybe this is a good time to take some questions from the audience. John Coleman is going to be rotating around, and maybe some others with microphones. So raise your hand and flag him down.
So Alexis, you talked about local water projects, and have you thought, it seems the dilemma is, and you mentioned it, the grant money that's available, even in your own grants, they require such expertise to apply for that nobody except the big agencies apply for them. Then the question is, so you've tried to get around that with the EJ percentage, but even that's kind of very difficult for
Excuse
local
me,
players.
could you, the speakers are having a little problem hearing you.
I'm sorry.
It's a little tricky, but that's good. Now you're coming through.
Gotcha. So on this issue of funding for rural projects, the dilemma is the existing grant sources are really difficult to apply for. For many agencies, for small amounts, it's just not cost effective, even though the money's there. You're better off in the bond market. I wondered, would there be, the expertise is in the big agencies. The dilemma is you could regionalize. There's the local control trade-off. maybe for all these, just like when a developer is developing a housing project, we ask them to set a certain, well, I'm setting it up, set a certain percentage aside for low-income projects. Maybe for every grant you give, you require, have you thought about requiring people to, if they get the grant, to have some percentage go to focused areas that need the money more?
That would be lovely. We don't have many grants, Mike, as you know, so the main grants we have are the State Revolving Fund for wastewater and drinking water infrastructure. In the Bay Area, Congress made possible the San Francisco Bay, the competitive grant program. It's one of the 50 to 60 that the president proposes to eliminate along with Mexican border. So I'm left with just a couple of grant programs that are run in partnership with the state of California, and those are the infrastructure grant programs. There is the ability to apply for non-point source grants through the state. I think that those don't as much reach some of the smaller communities, perhaps for some of the reasons that you articulate. But I do think that the regional boards play a key role, the water boards and the air boards, in trying to get funding to these locations. I'll give you an example. In the air program, there are some smaller foothill communities that use wood as their primary source of energy, like Portola near Chico. And if we can have a wood stove change-out program with that air district, we could bring that air district into compliance. So we have been working through a number of different compliance settlements, and with the air district in Carbon, a wood stove change-out that will bring Portola into compliance within the current year. I think where we focus, we can really come up with some great solutions. If I shift into Indian country, which is not a discussion we typically have here, a lot of Navajo homes burn coal in the home, which creates a whole series of public health issues. One of our staff was able to work and look nationally and internationally for what could be an in-home stove that lets you burn both coal and wood without the in-home emissions. And she's come up with a stove manufacturer in Ireland or Wales, I think, that has successfully demonstrated this at the state level. And if we can bring those stoves into Navajo homes through a series of other settlements, you can change the public health outcomes for a whole generation. So I'm finding a great deal of satisfaction in pursuing these kind of solutions, even where, you know, I would love to have other competitive grants that could work with the rural communities to get on the ground improvements. So Mike's point is a valid one. It's hard to get money on the ground in smaller communities, but where we can make a difference, I am seeing a host of different opportunities.
Anyone else want to weigh in, or should we go to the next question?
Yes, in the entire discussion today, an overarching issue is time. Will we see meaningful streamlining in our lifetime, or are we going to continue to go the other direction?
Streamlining of permits, for example. You know, I think that there is a real possibility, taking away all the circus-like mentality that's going on right now. This sort of has frozen the gears of doing regulatory reform or anything else in Washington right now, at least for this week. I think there's a real possibility to do regulatory streamlining, number one, that's modest, not dramatic. And number two, as I said earlier, looking and trying to figure out ways to get away from the process is the end result, and moving into getting permits done less than 10 years, 15 years, and challenges and what have you. I think there's a real possibility. Whether it happens in the next 2 to 3 years remains to be seen. But if they do infrastructure, that's a mechanism to also deal with some of the streamlining. And you've seen it in a number of congressional hearings when they talk about infrastructure. So I'm optimistic.
I would add maybe a good chance of it is you've got a lot of disruptors out there in the economy and emerging, you know, whether you're talking about Ubers or Lyfts or some of the other a whole new ways of doing things and business models that are actually ahead of the regulatory process, because the regulators are trying to figure out what's the best way to to manage these new industries. And we're in the heart of it in Silicon Valley, in our backyard, and San Francisco, in emerging technologies and new and faster and more efficient ways of doing things that maybe the private sector can lead by example. And the regulations may follow as opposed to the other way around. I'm not saying that will always work out to the benefit of the general public or that the industry is always right, but it adds a layer of possibility, I think, that can set a good example going forward for a good way to balance regulation, and so you have a healthy economy with a effective regulatory environment to, whether it's managing the environment or what have you.
I think I would just add that my sense is that has to be and can be a bottom-up process and not a top-down, so that there may be some things that do happen at the federal level and percolate down in terms of process streamlining and the executive order that should be attached to the top priority infrastructure that's identified for the nation. That may come with some expedited NEPA review, et cetera. I don't think it'll change the process, but it'll put some pressure to drive the schedule. But my sense is streamlining will happen best with the people in this room, with our regulators and our regulated, and our trust and our relationships that we build to move ourselves through that process, and having sort of a shared commitment to saying, this is taking too much. None of us need process for process sakes. We need outcomes, and we have a pretty good track record of driving to those, but we should continue for sure. And I appreciate, there's a little aspiration in that. All the agencies come with their mission and their top-down guidance, but mostly this happens on the ground, and we should take it.
I agree completely. If we are committed to more efficient processes, let's invest in them together. We all know that there are, in different kinds of ways of project management, there are different ways that successful projects make it through a complex process. And sometimes I think we fail to elevate things that are simmering at the staff level. And when time pressures kind of get us near to the finish line and things look really critical, then there's a whole lot of elevation and problem solving. But we don't invest enough, I think, at the beginning of cultivating the relationships and setting some of the ground rules and agreeing to check in with one another. I had a discussion a couple of weeks ago in a dredging context with a local project sponsor who had been silent for 18 months waiting for a federal agency to do something. And they were distressed, they were worried about the time frame, they were worried about losing the money, but they had never articulated that worry. They were sort of deferring to a federal agency, and I think that we don't have to continue to behave that way. We should get together and have a 15-minute conversation more regularly during the course of these projects to identify some of these problems and talk about what's next and who's going to do it by when. Most of us want to deliver on time and on budget and have successful outcomes. So if we can have the commitment to look at projects, what went wrong last time and what would we do differently, what went right. We don't do enough of that kind of analysis. We just go on to the next project. And I'd like us to invest a little bit more in looking at what's successful, what's unsuccessful, and how do we change.
Next question from the audience, and just a reminder, be sure and keep that mic close and speak up.
Okay, I'm Michael Warburton from the Public Trust Alliance, and I was just wondering, in getting around this process for process's sake logjam, doesn't the state have a actual obligation to protect public trust resources before irreparable harm is done? I mean, in the water case, you have the physical solution required. So we've been stuck in these processes that go on for years and years. Do any of you see any opportunities in the public trust doctrine with the obligation that an actual solution, has to be found before the resources are lost or damaged irreparably?
You'd like to weigh in on that? You want to take a stab?
You know, I think I don't see that handle, that public trust doctrine as a thing that will newly drive protection of our resources, but it is certainly one of our, foundational doctrines. And I would just reiterate that our state legislature just recently, as the Trump administration was stepping in, adopted a whole host of anti-backsliding, anti-sort of environmental regulation degradation. And just for context, this was done previously under the Bush administration, and as we have had these kind of changes in administration and philosophy about environmental regulations, our state remains at the forefront of saying, we're not backsliding on that. So I don't know if that provides opportunity to speed up the process, but it certainly continues a strong environmental regulatory environment.
I think just from a political standpoint, what's happened in California in recent years, it's kind of flown under the radar, but excuse me, the way we draw our districts with redistricting reform, we now have an open primary. There's a number of things, and then you've altered the term limits so that you can serve in one House, Assembly, or Senate longer than we were before, when it seemed like we had a Speaker of the Assembly every 2 years. So I think there's a little bit more predictability. You're seeing the voters pass things like having a bill in play for 72 hours before, so they can't quite get it through as quickly as they did before. So I think there's some good things happening from the governmental operational standpoint, if you will, that will, I think, help the public trust and also create an environment where hopefully our lawmakers are not just worrying about what office they're going to run for next, but actually be around long enough to see some of the things that their bills that are passed into law are doing.
Other questions?
Hi, Alexis Straus with Hatch. Eric, I was intrigued by your comments about Congress having more and more, focusing more and more on resiliency, and I was wondering if you saw funding and support at the federal level for resiliency kind of continuing on in stealth mode, or if you saw potential new pots of funding, either through an infrastructure spending bill or elsewhere.
I'm sorry, you were echoing. Could you just quickly repeat the question?
Sure, sorry.
The mic closer.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Excuse me. I was intrigued by your comments about Congress focusing more on resiliency, even with a Republican-led Congress. And I was wondering if you saw the support for resiliency kind of continuing on in stealth mode, or continuing limping along in current programs, or new pots of funding, even if there's not a major infrastructure spending bill.
Right. So I mentioned that the budget agreement that went forward about 2 weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago, essentially kept most of the federal programs at current spending levels. And what you saw was a rejection of efforts to eliminate estuary protection programs, rejection to eliminate Great Lakes restoration programs, a rejection of resiliency over the National Oceanic Administration with respect to monitoring storm events. And at the same time, you saw passage and enactment of legislation to reinforce the importance of extreme weather monitoring and recommendations on how to address that type of activity. So I think the question is, or the answer to the question is, we will have money going forward, irrespective of the outcome of infrastructure or what have you, because I fully expect that we won't have an appropriations bill in 2018. As I say, it's September 30th is when this year ends, and 2018 begins for the budget purposes. And that's politics. And the good news for anybody who likes some of these programs that were funded in the 2017 budget, Congress will have to default to a continuing resolution, which means traditionally current year spending goes for another year. So I think you'll at least see continued support programmatically for resiliency.
Do you want to weigh in? Okay, I'd like to thank the panel for their thoughtful comments. Thank you, audience, for your questions. And it's time to move on to the next panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Denis and panelists.